Who's introducing who?
Gee, yeah, well, we should just say hello first. Hello.
Hello, I'm John Wilkins,
And I'm PZ Myers.
and I guess I'll introduce Paul. Paul is well known as the cephalopod overlord of the marauding armies that are going to take over the world and make it safe for atheism. Maybe you want to cut that out.
No, that works. Yeah, that's okay. And Wilkins is what, the Australian philosopher who's going to make the world nice and soft and safe and fuzzy for agnostics.
Yes, that was a Freudian slip there, Paul. Paul and I know each other from the Talk Origins Usenet news group, where we were both combatants on the side of evolution for many years. He, of course, is a well-known atheist, and I, of course, am a well-known Chamberlainist, weak and soppy agnostic, and we have many interesting conversations about that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, Usenet was fun way back when, but we've moved beyond it, right? Have you checked into Talk Origins?
Yeah, no, I'm there pretty frequently. As I have no life, that's where I spend most of my time. Even now, things haven't changed particularly. The creationists haven't become any smarter, and the arguments haven't become any deeper. But every so often, somebody says something that I find interesting and follow up. I've always used Talk Origins as a way of getting a free science education, because there are a number of scientists on there, and at the moment a few people who I like to poke the way I used to like to poke you back in the day.
Well, yeah, and it's also a good place just to sort of hone those rapid response arguments to
Yeah.
little one-offs that creationists throw at you. So
Well, there's
it's a
that.
training ground for blogging.
Well, absolutely. There's that wonderful book that Mark Isaac put together, the Counter-Creationist Handbook, which basically summarised all of those arguments, and is now the index of creationist claims at www.talkorigins.org. And that's a very thick book with just about every argument one could ever encounter.
Yes, that you still encounter too, over and over
Yes,
and over again. Yes.
yes, indeed. And these days, of course, it's coming from places more broadly established in the United States and Australia, which seems to be the two places creationism took off. Now we're getting it from Turkey, and we're getting people in the Catholic Church applying some of those arguments, and people in the UK, and I hear of similar things in Germany and Holland and places of that kind. It's
Yes,
kind of worrying.
creation is spreading.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, but I actually assigned that that book in my class, my introductory biology class, and I mainly do it not because I use it extensively in the lecture materials or anything, but because it's a useful tool to short circuit a lot of arguments.
All right.
You always get freshmen who come in and think they're very clever, and they're going to slam you with this killer argument, and being able to open that little book and just thumb through it and find a page where it simply shows that they're just reciting old Kant.
Yeah.
It's so useful.
Yeah. I feel sorry for them, though. I mean, there's an excuse in believing in that stuff if you're a freshman.
Yes.
In that people tend to believe what is around them when they're young. There's a good reason, good evolutionary reason for that, I think. Somebody who is around you when you're young isn't dead, and therefore it's likely to be a fairly good thing to copy what they're doing. Unfortunately, it means that you get things that carry on which aren't good ideas, and so I feel very sorry for the freshman students that I have, and I treat them with respect. The ones I worry about are the ones who know the arguments are bogus and continue to put them forward. And of course, we sent our greatest exponent of that, Ken Ham, from this very city, Brisbane, to you many years ago, where he has wreaked all kinds of havoc.
Thank you so much.
That's okay. That's what we do here.
Would you like him back?
No, not at all. We have plenty of Americans here to make up for what we sent to you. Some of them even make up for Olivia Newton-John.
Yeah, okay. Well, Olivia Newton-John wasn't quite as bad as Ken Ham.
It depends who you ask.
Oh, you'll think about that.
Yeah, yeah. So, as you, the viewers may know, Paul has the most popular blog in the known universe. And I have one which has 6 viewers, I think, who check it every 30 seconds, which gives me my readership. So both Paul and I are bloggers in the Seed magazine group stable, which is kind of fun. And I used to really envy Paul's massive. How many do you get a week? 250,000, something insane like that.
Yeah, it's something. Well, it's like 1.5 million a month. So yeah, a little bit more than that.
That's an amazing number of web hits in anyone's language. I used to be quite upset about that until I realised, hey, I'm a philosopher. 6,000 people a week read me. That's probably more than most philosophers, except the French, of course. So
how many people do you think read biologists? Biologists aren't that much more popular than philosophers.
Oh, yes and no. I mean, Richard Dawkins has sold a few books in his day.
Oh, yeah.
Stephen Jay Gould.
There's a few exceptions, yes.
You're not going to find too many philosophers who have that sort of spread. So, over to you.
Over to me. Okay, well, we talked a little bit about various things we could talk about. And, of course, this is an opportunity for you to plug your book, right?
Oh, yeah. Well,
yeah.
I don't know that too many people are going to find it that exciting unless they happen to be working biologists who actually think philosophers might have something to say. But I have 2 books coming out. One is a reader of definitions of species since Aristotle and Plato, which will be coming out this year through Peter Lang Publishers. And it looks like it's all but bedded down that my history of species definitions, I won't say concepts because there's only one concept here, and that is species. Biologists think that there are many species concepts. There's only the one. But there's many definitions of what a species is. So I've got a history of that, I hope, coming out next year through University of California Press, which is a big coup for me and might even end up with me getting a few interviews for jobs. But we'll have to wait and see about that.
That's always to be hopeful.
Yes, absolutely.
But, I don't think you should downplay philosophy for biologists too much. It's, I mentioned I'm teaching this introductory biology course, and the interesting thing I've decided to do with this, since I got to design it from scratch this year, is it's got a great big philosophy component right at the beginning. So we spend about 4 weeks talking about history of biology and philosophy. And I think it's important for them, but can you guess what the students think?
They don't think it's important? They're wondering why we're doing this. Is this on the exam?
That's right. Yes, it's kind of painful. I mean, I kind of feel like, if you're going to be a scientist, you ought to know who Francis Bacon is, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And a lot of the students have a hard time getting it through their heads. They want me to get up there and recite a bunch of facts from the textbook about, here's how hemoglobin works or whatever. And to hear all this talk about, Greek philosophers and these old guys from England and France from a long, long time ago, like in the 1950s, is a lot of the students.
Well, I say to my students that scientists have a rolling wall of fog that follows them about 5 years behind. And the only papers that ever get cited are the ones that are the mountains that tower above the fog. Mostly scientists have a very ahistorical view of their own discipline and tend to believe the stories that are told in the textbooks. A thing that Thomas Kuhn used to call textbook history. It's almost always wrong. And it's almost always a history that's told in order to make the students accept, or other scientists accept, the standard views the views that are current in that science. That said, biology is more historical and more philosophical, I think, than most of the other sciences, possibly excluding medicine. Biologists, when they're naming species, have to appeal to previous descriptions, which can go back to the 18th century. When they're referring to particular anatomical structures, they usually refer to them by the name of the person who discovered them. And I have a kind of internal rule that if any scientist is going to talk philosophy, it's either going to be a cosmologist or it's going to be a biologist. Biologists seem to be fairly philosophically inclined, I think.
Right.
Which is...
well, there is that... Yeah, there is this tendency, though, that it's mainly the older biologists who start talking about the philosophy. But
this is true. Ernst Mayr basically stopped doing field biology and started writing history and philosophy. But I don't think that's a bad thing either, because it's often those people who guide the way that the working scientists think about their work from a philosophical perspective. When disciplines descend into wars about which method is the one to be used, as they did in taxonomy in the 1970s, it's very often that there are some deep philosophical issues underpinning that. And it helps to have the grand old, usually men, not always, of the disciplines who write the philosophy and to engage with what the philosophers themselves have to say. There's a tendency for scientists to think they can do philosophy better than those who are trained as philosophers. There's an equal and opposite tendency for philosophers to think that they can come up with scientific hypotheses better than those who are trained as scientists. So basically, we complement each other and prevent each other from making the same mistakes.
Right. Well, my general experience has been is that you start off in science, you get this training, and training is very methodological. That what you're doing is getting a job done in the lab, and the philosophy starts to creep in when you start doing more teaching. Mm-hmm. And what happens is that suddenly you've got to explain why you are doing this very bizarre, very esoteric little experiment where you're poking around in a single cell in some strange little animal, and you start digging into the history, and you use the history and philosophy to explain, here's why this is an important concept.
Yeah. Also, I think with sciences, concepts tend to grow a little bit like Topsy over the years, and they accrete all kinds of extra connotations. And very often people aren't even aware that they're swapping between different meanings for the same word. Obviously, my target concept is species. The number of different ways people talk about that is just astonishing. So one of the roles of a philosopher and a historian, because I see myself as a half and half philosopher-historian, is to try and uncover what the different meanings are and give them, make it clear so that it doesn't just become a homonym for a whole range of different concepts, which can confuse people when they're talking about stuff. So a term like gene, for example, has a multiplicity of meanings, and they're not always consistent and coherent. And you will get people from, say, molecular biology on the one hand and developmental biology on the other talking to each other about genes, and they'll in fact be talking past each other, which is, I think, something that a number of people have pointed out over the last 10 years, particularly people like Evelyn Fox-Keller and Paul Griffiths, the two. So,
well, this whole concept of ontology has become a really hot one in the last 15, 20 years in molecular biology and genetics. Mm-hmm. We've got to think more about what we're naming things. For instance, one particular peeve is BRCA1, the breast cancer gene. It's not a breast cancer gene, but I bet you that was a name that got them some grant money.
Well, yeah, but I mean, also geneticists tend to name genes in virtue of what they don't do. So there's a gene called eyeless, the absence of which means you don't grow eyes. And therefore we conclude that eyeless is actually an eye-contributing gene. It's one of those odd things that geneticists do purely in virtue of the way that they approach things with knockout genes.
Yes, no, I also teach genetics, and this has been one of the fun things about getting this across to students, especially when you start talking about epistatic interactions, you start talking about multiple genes working together. And, for example, one we went through in class was, there's two genes that contribute to eye color in flies. There's a brown pigment gene and a red pigment gene. And, of course, the brown pigment gene is called scarlet, and the red pigment gene is called brown.
Yes.
And so you're sitting there trying to explain this to a bunch of undergraduates.
Right.
And they're thinking you're nuts.
Yep. But any graphic artist who's familiar with the colour wheel would immediately know why you call them those, because it's the opposite colour on the colour wheel. I was a graphic artist for 25 years. Yeah.
Yes.
Which is one of the reasons why I have problems when people start talking about things like the God gene or the gay gene, because it is impossible for there to be a gene or even a gene complex which maps directly onto a trait like that. And that's, in fact, that's one of the senses of gene that's contradictory to modern molecular biology, and it's the one that goes back to Mendel. It's actually not a gene that you're talking about, it's a phenotypic trait, that is some aspect of a particular sort of body in an organism.
Yes. I agree completely. That's always been a big problem, and again, it gets back to this whole issue of grant money. The gay gene, the God gene, those are ploys to get money and attention and publicity, and they don't advance our understanding at all.
Well, they advance them to the extent that you're able to get the money to do your research. Hopefully the research will pay off in some way.
And they advance it in the sense that they are a useful thing to argue against and use as an example for not to name something, how not to describe a phenomenon. Yeah.
I don't so much mind that when done by scientists, because the target audience there are informed. They're other scientists who can raise merry hell if they think something really bad has been done in a scientific context. My problem there is that it feeds into the very narrow set of conceptual Tupperware containers that journalists have, that they have to put every story into. So everything's got to have drama, everything's got to be a breakthrough, or everything's got to be a disaster, or something along those lines. So when you talk about a God gene, journalists are going to jump on that and say, oh, well, we've done this, we've done that, we've explained this. And, of course, it's very easy for people to say, well, no, you haven't done that, you haven't explained this. That's just, verbal. It's not actual knowledge. And I think that feeds in, unfortunately, to the attitude that a lot of people have towards scientists who aren't scientists, that it's really just another belief system that can be challenged, because they're not actually seeing the data, they're not actually seeing the explanations and the knowledge that comes out of science. They're just seeing assertions made in words. So that worries me.
And many of the substantial things that we're working with are actually fairly abstract and remote from observation, and so that makes it doubly difficult for them. So we're throwing out these weird ideas, these weird concepts, and at the same time, when we sit down and explain to them, here's how we know this stuff, it takes a couple of years of book learning to be able to get through it all.
Absolutely. It's hard work. It takes time and energy to do this. So you can't blame people for not doing it unless they're trying to run some sort of an agenda in social policy. And that's where I think we academics, and I think in particular the scientists themselves, have to a large extent failed the sort of public discourse.
Right.
But
this is the big thing we've got to fight for next. Is we haven't been doing this, and we failed since the Scopes trial, where we're really not getting the message across, and we're not we're not communicating the fundamental ideals of science to the public at large. And no, that's why this creationism stuff keeps coming back to bite us. Is we haven't addressed their concerns.
Yeah, that's true, I think, but you've got to be careful of what's sometimes referred to as the deficit model of science communication, that more facts are going to somehow get people to accept what science says. The problem is that I think science is both a hands-on process where you're likely to believe it more if you see it being done or do it yourself. And it's also an incremental process. It's something that you won't understand concepts at that level before you've understood the concepts at that level. And in a similar way to mathematics or for that matter theology. I mean, I was a theology student and they teach you the basics and then you elaborate on that. It takes work to do that. And for that reason, for some years now, I've been claiming that the main way to oppose anti-science, or as I prefer to think of it, anti-modernism, because it's part of a more general social thing, social movement, is to address it at the educational level and from very early on. I think the way we teach science in the West is just dreadful. And I think it's because we thought the earlier way of teaching science was elitist, which it was because it was addressing those who were capable of learning certain disciplines. We've moved too far in the other direction and now we don't teach science at all. What we teach are facts gathered under a general banner of science that people are supposed to take on faith, more or less. I mean, I'm exaggerating for effect, but...
Well, I agree completely with you. I mean, and when I say we've got to do a better job, I'm not trying to follow the deficit model at all. I agree with you completely that that's something that's going to work. That, for instance, what I see is as a root symptom, if not a cause of the problem, is what you see in young kids. You look at young kids; they're all excited about science, they're thrilled about it. You go to third grade science fairs, and they are just wonderful. They're stupid, simple little experiments.
Yep.
But the kids have the idea. Let's tinker. Let's find out. Let's explore. And you go along to a science fair a few years later, and what you find is drudgery. They've been instructed by their teachers. Here is the way you do a science experiment. You test the effect of X on Y, and you measure it 3 times, and you put it together in this formal report, and you're done. And you can tell it rips the heart out of their enthusiasm for science. So, yeah, I don't think the answer is for me to get in front of grade school kids and lecture them about complicated subjects in genetics. The answer is more hands-on, more exploration, more indulgence of imagination.
Yeah.
That's what we really need.
It has a nasty side effect too, in that it's pre-selects people for doing science who are going to be relatively unimaginative, because you've got to fit into that sort of here's your problem, here are your materials, here are your methods, here is the analysis, here is the conclusion, and so on. I mean, science papers today are just boring as all get up. And I suspect...
But they're very efficient. They're very condensed. I
yes.
Science paper and pull out the key points very, very quickly. And this is another thing I've seen in students, is you hand them these papers, the first time they are totally baffled by this thing. They don't understand how to read, how to study.
Yeah.
But it's one of the skills you learn as a scientist. And yeah, it's limiting, but it's also very powerful as a way to condense information.
Well, that's true. I mean, I'm not knocking the structure or the conventions, but it means that somebody who's not a scientist, who's not trained in it, typically a journalist or a philosopher or somebody else who lacks the background to really read it properly, and we come along and we get the wrong idea. Now, I saw that you had a fully justified attack upon the way journalism was treating the platypus paper that was just recently published. For those who don't know, this is a paper which has sequenced the platypus genome and has been reported in the press as the platypus is a mosaic of reptilian, avian, and mammalian characteristics, which isn't the case. But the problem is people didn't know the background, and so that's the way it's been pushed in the media. There's a nasty tendency of science to be done by press release these days, which is worrying.
Right. Yeah, but I mean that was a good example of the problem, and you know I read the paper, I read the platypus paper, and it's a short paper in Nature, but it's got the same symptoms we're just talking about. It's very condensed, it's very technical, it's got lots of jargon. You know, if you don't know what a back is, tough. It's there. There's the acronym. You got to understand this.
Yeah.
And it makes me wonder how the journalists are getting this information, because most of them aren't going to be able to read those papers.
Yeah.
I know my students couldn't read that paper. You know, maybe the seniors could, but entering students could not, and they have to get all this training in science before they're even up to speed on touching a paper like that. Well, so yeah, the journalists must be relying on things like university press releases.
Yeah, I think I have to confess here to an evil sin of mine that for a time I was a university press release writer, and I know from experience that when somebody is trying to get information that they know as technical experts to you as a generalist who presumably can write, that it's going to take 4 or 5 iterations before the expert is actually satisfied with the material in the press release. And even then, it will not communicate easily to the laity. So journalists, by definition, are uneducated. I can say this because I worked in a newspaper for a couple of years. And so they've probably done a journalism degree with a secondary minor in economics or political science, maybe history if you're lucky. So it gives them a science paper, and they have no idea what to make of it. They simply don't know any of the background. So when they get something which is already at one removed from the source, they don't even know what questions to ask about it. So for that reason, I really think that the mainstream media, and to an extent even the new media, aren't the way to go about getting people into science. I think blogs do a lot better at it, which is why I've got that basic concepts in science post that I keep updating. When people write blog entries for something that's that they know and can express to the wider public, I'll put that up there. But even that's not going to have, I think, much long-term impact. It still takes time to read it, and at the end of it, you only know what's been put in the blog. You still don't know all the background. I have no magic bullet for this.
Right. No, and then, of course, the other problem is the solution is not to train scientists to take over the job of journalists.
Absolutely not.
That doesn't work either.
Absolutely not.
There's going to be very few scientists who want to do it, even fewer scientists who will be able to do it well. What we need is some way to bring scientists and journalists together in a rational, cooperative way to get the message out there. And so far, it looks to me like they're operating in such independent worlds that there's not much overlap.
Well,
we see some.
It's Snow's two cultures thing, isn't it? I mean, it's those who understand technical aspects of science and those who don't, basically, is the way to divide the world at the moment. And it seems to me that doing that basically means you're going to marginalise science as a part of the wider sort of public discourse and policy making.
Right. I mean, the other strategy that we see in some people, and Carl Zimmer comes to mind as a perfect example.
Carl's wonderful. Yeah.
Is a journalist who specializes in science and who actually digs deep into the science. But those seem to be very rare too, and with staff at newspapers being cut all the time, it's really hard to support a specialist like that, I would think.
Yeah.
So they have to sit around and write books or something to make money.
Books, I think, are definitely the way to get the message out and to inspire people. I mean, how many people are inspired into biology by the selfish gene? I know at least 6 or 8 people who read that book
Yeah.
and were just so taken by it. Now, in every case, they've moved a long distance away from that, but that was a book that really got them excited about evolution and biology.
Right.
So,
and what it is it's a different level of explanation too. It's a book that doesn't sweat over the fine details and tries to get the big ideas across and does it in a very literate and easy to read way.
Yep.
We need more books like that.
I'd love to see one on vaccination like that. You're breaking up a bit there. There we go. Yep. I'd love to see somebody take on vaccination in the same way that, say, Carl did evolution, or his recent one on microbes, microcosm. Yeah. Because it's a good, when written well, it's a great way to get lots of people to understand the main issues of stuff. I mean, I worked for a while with the guy who was running the World Health Organization program on immunization, and he said to me one day that, this is Gus Nossel, well-known immunologist, he said to me one day that dollar for dollar, vaccination is the single best medical step that can be taken anywhere in the world. And yet we have people who are not vaccinating themselves, and we see a rise of whooping cough and measles again that we haven't seen for 80 years.
Yes.
So we really need to get those sorts of things.
Right, and that's probably a better example of the evolution and creation controversy, because that's one where it's much more narrow and it has immediate consequences, well, at least immediate in terms of a short number of years. And we're seeing the same problem of growing ignorance, growing refusal to address the issues. And it's another one where we don't have a simple solution. We don't have a strategy for dealing with this that's very effective right now. Evolution is an even bigger issue and even harder to address.
Yeah, it's hard to get across to some people why evolution matters. It seems to be quite some distance from their ordinary everyday life. Whereas, well, the vaccination issue I mentioned is a classic example of where an aspect of evolution really does matter to ordinary health, because we're basically selecting for diseases that can sidestep immune responses and antibiotics and so forth these days. So, but as a philosopher, I think evolution is actually more important, largely because it's just a really cool set of ideas. And it's something that's quite unlike anything that we've had in the whole of Western history. For that matter, I don't think anything quite like it has ever been put forward under any civilization or tradition. So,
okay, so where were we? We were talking about this problem that we've got, this conceptual problem, and we were talking about vaccination as an example of explaining things, an important concept to explain to people. And just to tie it back to what we were saying earlier about public education, what we should be doing with our kids, and I was thinking this is something I've said before, is that on our side, I think we tend to focus too much on getting across the details. That what we do is we promote things like, oh, well, you've got to teach all this stuff about evolution in public schools, when that may not be the most important thing to get across to them.
Yeah.
I've often said that I would be happy to throw evolution out of the schools if they would also get better math education. If we could trade off evolution for calculus in the public schools, I think that might be acceptable. Right now, as it's.
I mean, there's something about calculus that's particularly the sort of differential calculus that itself represents a major change in the way people started thinking in the 17th century about change. And I have a friend, Mark Collivan, who's written a book with a an ecologist, Lev Ginsberg, and one of the things they point out is that with the Newtonian revolution, now you had to think of change as rates of change rather than just a straightforward change. So things changed the rate at which they were falling rather than just falling, if you see what I mean. Yep. So it's a second order and even a third order notion of change. We still, I don't think, have got that across to people. That what matters isn't, for example, that the inflation rate at the moment is X, but that the inflation rate is changing at a certain rate. And that's the worrying thing. So these are ideas that can have very broad impact that people really don't get.
Right. Oh, yes. And so when we're trying to go over their heads and say, okay, well, we're going to teach you all about evolution, but these are people who don't understand, for instance, basic statistics, or don't understand basic probability theory, you lose them right off the bat, and you're wasting a lot of effort trying to backtrack and cover stuff that's, fill in the background that they don't have.
Yeah.
And it's also one of these things where, like I said, with these science fairs and so forth, we're kind of ripping the soul out of their enthusiasm by saying, well, you've got to learn X, Y, and Z. When what we should be saying is, well, we'd like you to learn X really well.
Yeah, yeah.
And then you will see that Y and Z follow from it.
There was a wonderful television presenter here back in the 1960s, a Canadian by the name of Julius Sumner Miller, who, as it happens, had been a student of Einstein's. And he ran, in addition to running, I think, the physics department of the University of Sydney, he ran a series of television shows called Why Is It So? And anyone who saw those in the 1960s still remembers particular experiments that Sumner Miller did for these school kids. And the thing was that you learned, I can remember him doing the motion down an inclined plane thing that Galileo had done. And this is 45 years later, I remember this. There's nothing like that now. Even David Attenborough's wonderful TV series, which I don't know whether you get them there.
We get bastardized versions.
Oh, that's terrible, because there's such wonderful shows where he is talking about. The series that finished here last night was on on cold-blooded animals. So we're talking, alligators and turtles and frogs. A pretty disparate set, but as engaging as those are, they don't teach you the underlying principles. And I cannot see anything like what Sumner Miller used to do in the 60s on modern television.
Yes. No, I agree. Well, in the 60s we had the equivalent, which was Mr. Wizard.
Yeah, I remember seeing him.
Probably very much the same.
Yeah.
Kind of a laid back guy who just with a crew cut who got in there and led his students through experiments. It was thrilling stuff. Nowadays we do. Well, at least a few years ago, we had Bill Nye.
Yeah.
It was in the same vein, a little bit more frenetic, more MTV, but I think he got some of the ideas across.
You do? Okay.
Yeah, well, also, when this semester, I actually asked my students, I polled them on who have they heard of that's a famous scientist. And it was shocking that the only one most of them could come up with is Bill Nye. And a few mentioned Marie Curie.
Yeah.
So that's our gap.
Yeah.
They've heard of Marie Curie and then Bill Nye.
Mm. Well, all of this seems to me to be part of a broader social movement that I call anti-modernism. People may have heard of postmodernism. I don't know what that is. But whatever it's post to is what I think is something worth defending. People talk about modernism, but that was an architectural style. I think what people are reacting to is the complexity of the modern world. It's too much for them to take in critically. So what they want prepackaged, easy to digest bits of knowledge that they can say, yes, now that's stable. And of course, anybody who knows how science works knows that that's not really what's going on at the workplace in the lab. There's lots of uncertainty, lots of revision, lots of argument. Not the sort of argument that the creationists try to manufacture, but real argument about the substantive scientific things, which means it's really hard to get that across to people who are just swamped by the modern world. And I think that there's a general problem of how to deal with modernity, a term I don't like to use, but it's out there. So,
In general, though, scientists love to embrace change. Change is a good thing.
For the scientists.
Yes, the scientists do. But you can tell the public does not want anything to do with that. They want everything to stay the same. And that sets up a fundamental conflict that often flares up in things like the evolution creation wars and so forth. Oh, and climate change. That's a weird one. There's one where scientists are all saying, no, things are changing. And it's like the public is saying, but we don't want it to change, so we will therefore disbelieve it.
Yeah, although I get the impression that the public would be happy to accept that climate change was happening and was caused by human beings if it weren't for the constant attempts to sow doubt by those who have a vested interest in it. So the group of people who swift boat anyone that says anything that some industry or government or administration or political party does not like. In the absence of that muddying of the signal, I think people would be quite confident that climate change is occurring, just the way that anyone who works in the field is confident, and because of that. Right. But it looks to me like we've made dissimulation something of a sort of a permanent institution in our society.
Yes.
Fundamentally, I blame the invention of public relations in the Second World War, but that's a whole other matter.
Well, before that, it's just propaganda. That's been around for a lot longer than that.
Propaganda is one of those words that meant usually good things up until about 1935. Yes. Propaganda used to mean the spreading of ideas, the spreading of a message. Mm-hmm. It was not in itself morally good or bad. Then along came Goebbels and other people who followed his techniques. And suddenly propaganda is code word for telling lies, but telling them really effectively. So we moved away from that. We invented public relations, and public relations became a way of defending the indefensible. And now it just means telling lies, but telling them really effectively. So maybe this is something human beings have always done. I don't know.
Well, I suspect we've been doing it for a long time, but it just periodically changes names. So
yeah.
Then we had public relations. Now we got framing, and it's.
Ah, yes, the F word. You really don't like the F word. Yeah. See, I'm not sure. I've not really followed this that closely. For those who aren't aware, there's something of an internecine dispute amongst the seed bloggers between those who are in favour of a technique known as framing to get messages across, and those who think that it means basically putting a spin on something for propagandistic reasons, and that therefore it ought not to be used for science. I think there remains the fact that you cannot communicate to somebody unless you do so in terms which don't stretch them very far from where they already are, and that's a problem with education. It's a problem with communication. If you try to get a message across and people are simply unable to absorb the message, then you can talk and get nowhere. So to that extent, I think the underlying principles of framing are in fact good ones. Now, whether or not...
Yes, but I see it. It's in the same way we were just talking about propaganda once being a good thing.
Yeah.
PR was a good thing. Framing is also a reasonable idea, but it's a reasonable idea that can be used in very, very bad ways. And my dissent is not with framing itself, but with what I see as an ongoing pattern of abuse of framing to carry across false ideas.
Well, I suspect that what's going on here has something to do with professional boundaries. There are those who wish to mark out for themselves territory as science communicators,
Yes.
and see that what scientists do is different, and it is, as we've been discussing, and they want to... Possibly they have the best of intentions here. They really think that they've got a method which will get the message across, and they don't want confusion to occur. That's how it looks to me on a charitable reading. I think that...
I would agree completely with that. I would agree with that interpretation. It's just that, what I've generally found is that certain practitioners tend to push it in particular directions that I find objectionable, where suddenly it stops being a tool that can be used objectively to promote a truth to a propaganda tool to propagate a slant. And I think as scientists we have to be very careful of that boundary, that we don't want to get in that position where suddenly we find ourselves mistrusted because what we can do can be interpreted anyway.
Yeah, well, so that's a slippery slope argument in a sense. There's a wonderful story about George Bernard Shaw talking about sexual morality at a party, and he was talking to this woman of good repute who was against free love, and Shaw apparently said, "Madam, would you sleep with me for £1 million?" And the woman said, "Well, yes, I suppose I might." And then Shaw said, "Madam, would you sleep with me for £1?" And she replied, "Sir, what do you think I am?" To which Shaw replied, "We've established that, and now we're haggling over the price." Effectively, all of us are to some extent running propaganda. That's, I think, something which is in the human condition. Scientists run propaganda both in debates between themselves and in debates with the broader society. The question is, are they doing this to advance the cause of knowledge, or are they doing it to advance their own cause? I'm thinking here of the HIV deniers, who cannot be doing it for any other reason than to try and establish themselves as significant figures in a debate. So, I mean, it's not that it's entirely wrong to do a bit of selling here and there, and it's not that scientists are going to do it in a way that is qualitatively different from the way a science communicator will do. Really, at this point, what we're trying to do is negotiate where the price lays, so to speak.
Yes. Well, I've been told that I'm good at framing, which I guess I can take as a compliment. All right, and
I would take it as a compliment.
Yeah, and in the sense that it's used, I kind of agree that when I'm writing something on the blog, what I'm doing is I am gearing it for a particular audience, and I'm skewing it in particular ways, and I'm simplifying it in other ways, and I think that's perfectly reasonable. What I object to is when you take framing and you start using it as a bludgeon, and you say, well, this is my idea, and I have framed it scientifically, and I have determined that it is the objective truth, and therefore you have to accept my particular opinion on this. When framing is used as a tool to close off the debate and say that it's been settled, that science in a very soft and fuzzy way has determined it, then I think it's becoming bad for us.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you frame it in that sense, of course, who could disagree? But as you know, I'm
Frame that again. Oh,
yes,
darn.
you did. You can't help it. Uh,
Yes.
but it seems to me that John Stuart Mill was absolutely right. We need more voices, not fewer. And so I would rather see you talking. I would rather see the framers talking. I would rather see people who are against science talking. I would like to see there to be many voices so that people can get exposed to a lot of different positions and different ways of communicating things.
Right, and those voices have to be raised in argument with each other.
Yes.
If you're just kind of blandly going along and not disagreeing, then you are not doing your job.
Yeah. Well, Mill would agree with that too. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. We won't. You and I disagree, for example, on the nature of religion.
Yes.
This is one area where every so often you will poke me with your blog and I will poke you with my blog, and we will have a brief flurry of exchanges.
My blog pokes harder, though.
Well, that's because you're an atheist, and therefore you're pushing an agenda, whereas, of course, I'm an agnostic, and I don't know what I think, so I can't be quite so confident.
Right. I'm also amoral, and I have no limits, so that's another factor.
Oh, but I think we share that. Every so often I pass people who want me to sign this or that petition, and I usually say to them, look, I'm sorry, I'm a moral vacuum, and walk on past, and they really don't know how to respond to that. But where you think that there is, as I have read you, you think there is good reason to believe there is no deity. I don't think there's good reason to conclude there is or is not a deity. And we've argued about this. You think that's a form of atheism, and I don't. I think that is a form of agnosticism, and this is something I don't think you and I will ever agree on unless we both are drinking a lot of beer in the same place long enough.
Well, the other way we'll agree is when the theists hang us together.
That's true. That is true. I live in a country where some 40-50% of people never think about religion. We have a state religion, and therefore that's as good as having no religion whatsoever. And consequently, I'm not likely to be lynched here. But in America, I gather it's a different kettle of fish, that to be an atheist is to be several steps lower than paedophiles and car salesmen. So you probably have a lot more to worry about than I do over here. I gather the United Kingdom is a lot more like Australia than it is like America as well.
Yes, yeah.
Apparently,
some time ago, I was actually denounced before a meeting of the church councils of my county.
Really?
Which has me totally baffled, because I'm not a minister or something. I don't quite know what they expected to be able to do by denouncing me to this particular church council. But I'm thinking of putting it on my resume.
Well, I think you should write to them and at least ask for an opportunity to speak in your own defence. Of course, when you get there, what you say is probably going to reinforce their denunciation. But at the very least, at the very least, you'd have fun, and they'd have a better foundation for their fear and loathing. But come the cephalopod revolution, I'm quite sure that you'll be able to convince them all that you were right all along by force of tentacle.
Oh, right. Yes, okay.
The joke here.
I'll give it a shot.
The joke here is that Paul thinks that octopuses and squid and cuttlefish and the like are the most advanced form of life on the planet. Would that be a fair evaluation?
Well, there's a lot of insects that give them a run for the money, but perhaps the most beautiful.
Certainly the most beautiful. Yes. I think we could agree on that, if nothing else.
Right.
Well, that's pretty much all I've got to say. I better go and have some lunch now.
Half an hour.
Yeah, and thanks very much, Paul. It's been a lot of fun.